Racist cops mocked and humiliated a black man in court, thinking it was just another day of jokes at the expense of someone who couldn't fight back. What they didn't know was that the man standing silently in front of them, absorbing every insult with clenched fists and locked eyes, was an undercover FBI agent. And what happened next turned that courtroom into the most shocking reversal of justice anyone in that town had ever witnessed. It started like so many stories we try to forget: routine traffic stop, wrong neighborhood, wrong car, wrong skin color. A black man behind the wheel of a sleek black Mercedes-Benz, rolling through a suburb known for its manicured lawns and historically white population. They didn't ask for his license first. They asked where he stole the car from. They didn't ask for registration. They asked why someone like him would dare drive through that zip code like he belonged. And when he tried to speak calmly, tried to explain, tried to not escalate, they escalated for him. The cuffs were cold. The smirks were colder. But it wasn't until he was paraded into that courtroom, with whispers trailing behind him and laughter echoing from the uniforms lining the back wall, that humiliation became personal. "You clean up nice for a car thief," one of them chuckled just loud enough for the room to hear as the man stood alone before the judge, hands still marked by the steel of the cuffs. Another officer leaned in and added with a twisted grin, "Bet that Benz smelled like weed and fast food anyway. You people always leave traces." The court clerk tried to suppress a laugh. Even the bailiff cracked a smile. The man didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared ahead, his eyes fixed not on the judge, not on the laughing cops, but on something deeper, something only he could see coming. That silence was misread. They took his stillness for shame. They assumed, like they always did, that he had no power, no title, no voice. But they had no idea who they were laughing at. The charges were vague: reckless driving, resisting arrest, suspicion of auto theft. No evidence. Just reasonable suspicion and officer testimony. That was enough. In most places, it still is. And they knew it. They counted on it. What they didn't count on was what came next. Because this man, this so-called suspect, wasn't just passing through. He wasn't just anyone. He had chosen that car, that route, that time, that courtroom, for a reason. He was there to deliver something much bigger than an explanation. He was there to drop the weight of truth so hard it would shake every badge in that room. And while the officers mocked his clothes, questioned his presence, made jokes about his kind always finding their way back to jail, he kept memorizing every face, every laugh, every word. Because he'd been collecting more than evidence. He was collecting masks. The badges in that courtroom weren't just stained by bias. They were part of something deeper: patterns of fabricated arrests, planted evidence, silence from supervisors, and worse, entire reports rewritten to cover each other's tracks. And all of it, every last word, was now in his hands. But still, in that moment, all he could do was stand there and take it. The judge looked disinterested. The defense attorney assigned to him barely skimmed the file. The case was set to be dismissed for lack of evidence, but not before every single officer got their laugh in, like it was some sort of inside joke. And that's when it happened. That one phrase, the one that echoed louder than all the others, landed like a slap to the face of every person of color who's ever been told they don't belong. "You should be thankful we didn't shoot you," one of the officers whispered, close to his ear, as they unshackled him in front of the courtroom. "Would have saved us all this paperwork." The room stayed quiet. Nobody said a word. Nobody objected. And in that moment, you could feel it: decades of oppression, centuries of stolen dignity, compressed into one boiling silence. But the man didn't flinch. He simply adjusted the cuff of his jacket, straightened his posture, and walked out of the courtroom. But here's the thing: he didn't walk out defeated. He walked out ready. Because this wasn't a random traffic stop. This wasn't about a car. This wasn't even about race, entirely. This was about justice. About exposure. About turning the system inside out from the inside. What those officers didn't realize was that they had just humiliated not a suspect, but an agent. An agent trained in deep undercover operations. A man with full access to federal surveillance, documentation, wiretaps, and resources they couldn't even imagine. And every insult, every smirk, every illegal word spoken in that courtroom, had been recorded. Stored. And filed. By him. The trial wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because 3 weeks later, when Internal Affairs knocked on the station's front door with sealed federal orders, and those same laughing officers were called in one by one for questioning, panic set in. When their phones stopped working, when their bank accounts were frozen, when their body cam footage mysteriously resurfaced after being lost, they knew something was wrong. But they still didn't know just how wrong it was. Until the man walked back into the courtroom. Not in handcuffs this time. Not as a suspect. But in a tailored black suit, with a federal badge on his chest, and a calm, deadly quiet voice that cut through the air as he placed folders on the judge's bench and looked each officer directly in the eye. And then, he spoke. But what did he say? And what exactly was in those folders? What secret had he been hiding all along? And how far had he gone to get the justice so many others were denied? Stay with us. Because what happened next left the entire courtroom in shock, and turned the hunters into the hunted in a way no one saw coming. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. To our black audience watching this, know that you are seen, heard, and valued. This channel is a safe space where your voice and your story matter. We believe in powerful storytelling that exposes truth and empowers those who've been silenced. Now, get ready for a jaw-dropping ride, because this story will shake you. Don't forget to hit subscribe and join us on this journey of powerful twists and unforgettable lessons. Enjoy the story. His name was Darius Whitaker, and to most people in Fairgrove, Georgia, he was invisible. Not in the literal sense, but in the way black men often are in towns like that, seen only when convenient, noticed only when feared, acknowledged only when mistaken for someone else. Darius was 39, sharp-minded, broad-shouldered, and quiet in a way that made people underestimate him. He'd mastered that silence, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Because in towns like Fairgrove, speaking too boldly with skin like his could cost you more than a job or an opportunity. It could cost you your safety. Your dignity. Your entire name. He had grown up 3 hours south, in Albany, Georgia, raised by a mother who worked triple shifts and a grandfather who used to say, "They'll only respect you when they need you. Make them need you." He remembered that advice every day. Especially on the day he drove into Fairgrove behind the wheel of a 2021 black-on-black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, dressed in a plain gray hoodie, jeans, and Air Max sneakers. Clothes that made him look like just another guy to most, and something suspicious to others. But Darius wasn't there to stand out. He was there to blend in. What no one in Fairgrove knew, what no one even imagined, was that Darius had spent the last 12 years working as a deep-cover field operative for the FBI. Specializing in public corruption, racial profiling, and systemic abuse within local law enforcement, he had built entire careers dismantling lies brick by brick. He was methodical. Calm. Observant to the point of psychic. He didn't chase drama, he watched it unfold, and then pulled the thread that unraveled everything. But Fairgrove was different. It wasn't just a case file or another stop on a rotation. It was personal. 2 years before, a young man named Corey Jameson, just 19, had died in police custody after a routine stop. The department had called it an unfortunate reaction to a pre-existing condition. No body cam footage. No witnesses. No questions. Case closed. But Corey's mother had questions. Darius read her letter, handwritten, desperate, grieving. She had sent it to a dozen agencies. Only the FBI responded. And only Darius took the mission. Fairgrove was picture-perfect on the outside. Southern charm. Magnolia trees. 2 diners on Main Street. And a police department that prided itself on discipline and order. What it really had was a culture of unchecked authority, a boys' club wrapped in blue uniforms and bulletproof arrogance. Darius had spent the last 8 months weaving himself into the background. He rented a small apartment on the east side of town. Took a job at a local garage under an alias. Attended city council meetings. Befriended janitors, clerks, and waitresses. And all the while, he watched. 3 names stood out: Officer Ryan Kessler, Sergeant Brandon Duke, and Lieutenant Chad Morris. Together, they were a trifecta of corruption, the kind that didn't scream their hate, but smiled through it. They were charming in public and venomous in private. Ryan had a habit of pulling over young black men for routine checks. Brandon doctored arrest reports. Chad oversaw internal affairs and made sure no complaint ever stuck. They had created a system where black residents of Fairgrove were statistics to be managed, not citizens to be protected. And they were untouchable, until now. Darius had built the case in silence. Audio recordings from locker room conversations. Discreet videos of officers planting evidence. Logs from falsified arrest records. Hours of conversations where they laughed about teaching a lesson to suspects who didn't know their place. He had the receipts. But timing mattered. He needed one final piece, a public incident, something undeniable, something so brazen that it couldn't be swept under the rug. And when the opportunity presented itself, he didn't flinch. That morning, he dressed exactly how they expected him to. Hoodie. Chain. Watch just expensive enough to raise eyebrows. He left the Mercedes parked slightly askew in a space near the courthouse, engine running. It was bait. Within minutes, Officer Kessler rolled up behind him, siren off but eyes full of performance. Darius knew the play before it started. Kessler would claim he didn't see the plates. Ask about ownership. Then escalate. And just like clockwork, it unfolded. Brandon Duke arrived moments later. Darius didn't resist. He didn't speak out. He let them put him in cuffs. Let them mock him. Because he wasn't just trying to collect evidence, he was forcing them to show their true faces, in public, in front of witnesses, and eventually, under oath. Inside the courthouse, the mood shifted. Darius had walked into courtrooms before, always on the side of prosecution, always with the weight of the bureau behind him. But this time, he was silent. Playing the part. The clerk barely looked at him. The public defender assigned to his case didn't ask any questions. The officers joked openly in the hallway. Ryan whispered to the judge during recess. And Chad Morris, who wasn't even on duty that day, showed up just to watch. In the back row sat a man with folded arms and a stiff jaw, Deputy U.S. Attorney Marcus Livingston. Darius had briefed him months earlier. Marcus didn't say a word. Just watched. Studied. Every moment was being documented. Every smirk logged. Every racial slur whispered into Darius's ear by officers who believed they were untouchable added weight to the justice about to fall. But what Darius hadn't accounted for, what caught even him off guard, was how deeply humiliating the moment would feel, even with the plan in motion. Because it wasn't a performance for him. It wasn't an act. He had grown up hearing these words. Had seen men like these destroy futures with pens and lies. He had walked past closed doors where decisions about boys like him were made without anyone like him present. And now, here he was, living it again, not as a scared kid in Albany, but as a federal agent in silence, swallowing rage, watching the system gloat. They mocked him when he stood before the judge. Called him another thug with a car too expensive to belong to. One even asked if he wanted fries with his court date. Laughter echoed from the gallery. The judge said nothing. The courtroom wasn't just biased, it was complicit. And Darius took it all in. Every insult. Every look. Every breath. Because he knew something they didn't. They thought they were humiliating a suspect. But they were signing their own downfall. They just didn't know when it would come. Outside, the sky turned gray. Thunder rolled in the distance. Darius sat alone in a holding cell for 37 minutes. He counted each one. Not because he was nervous, but because he knew what was waiting on the other side. He knew which doors would open. Which agents were watching. Which judge had been reassigned the moment the hearing ended. And which officers were already on borrowed time. But in that moment, in that stale, quiet room with a metal bench and white walls, Darius allowed himself one rare emotion. Not anger. Not vengeance. Just grief, for the years he had spent seeing this over and over. For the lives lost in silence. For the boys like Corey, whose mothers never got answers. For the towns like Fairgrove, where hate wore a badge and smiled through courtroom windows. And then, he stood up. Straightened his shoulders. Took a deep breath. Because it wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The next morning, the air in Fairgrove was thick with tension, though most of the town didn't know why. To them, it was just another Thursday. But for Darius, it was the start of a shift in gravity. After the court incident, whispers had begun, not about what had happened, but about him. Word traveled fast through police stations and city offices, especially when pride was involved. Officer Kessler had told the story like a badge of honor, twisting details, painting himself as the hero who put a thug in his place. At the diner on Main Street, two deputies chuckled about how Darius didn't even fight back, said he looked lost, like a deer in headlights. But what no one realized was that Darius heard everything. Through ears that weren't his. Through eyes placed in walls. Through voices captured and archived. He didn't just hear the laughter, he recorded it. Still, Darius didn't change his routine. He returned to work at the garage like nothing had happened. He greeted Miss Lorraine at the front desk of the apartment complex like he always did. But underneath every casual smile, every calm breath, there was movement, silent, strategic. He made 2 calls that night from a secure line. One to his handler in D.C., confirming that Phase 2 was ready. The second to Marcus Livingston, who said only 5 words, "We're green. Make it count." The next day, Brandon Duke showed up at the garage, sunglasses on, leaning against his patrol car like he was starring in his own little movie. Darius was under the hood of a Dodge Charger when he heard the Boots approach. Brandon called out, "You're not gonna believe it, man. Your court case. Dismissed. You're a free man." Darius didn't look up. He wiped his hands on a rag, kept his voice steady. "Didn't think I wasn't." Brandon laughed, a long, slow laugh that dripped arrogance. "You got lucky. I've seen guys like you run out of luck real quick." Darius finally turned to him, eyes still quiet but unshaken. "Maybe luck's not what I'm running on." Brandon smiled, but his eyes narrowed. "You got something to say, say it." Darius shrugged. "I don't waste words." That conversation set something off. It wasn't what Darius said, it was what he didn't say. Brandon couldn't shake it. That night, he called Ryan. "Something's off about that guy," he said. "Too calm. Too clean. Ever check his ID?" Ryan waved it off, said, "He's just another mouthy mechanic. Let it go." But Brandon didn't let it go. He asked Chad to run the plates on Darius's car. The system came back clean, under a different name, registered out of D.C. Brandon started digging. But the more he dug, the less he found. And that scared him more than anything. Meanwhile, Darius was laying the final groundwork. For weeks, he had been feeding the bureau data, audio clips, surveillance images, GPS tracking of patrol routes. Everything meticulously organized and time-stamped. But he needed one more piece, a confession. Not just one-on-one. He needed it in front of others. And he knew just how to get it. The town's annual law enforcement banquet was 3 days away. It was hosted at the Fairgrove Civic Hall, an event designed to celebrate the bravery and sacrifice of local officers. Darius pulled strings. He made sure his garage offered to sponsor part of the event, under his alias. That gave him a seat. He even offered to repair the sound system beforehand, standard practice, no one batted an eye. What they didn't know was that the new sound system came with live audio feeds and discrete backups stored off-site. On the night of the banquet, the room was packed. Officers in uniform. Local business owners. Judges. City council members. Even the mayor. Darius blended in, wore a navy blue suit, no tie. He shook hands, smiled politely. All while his wire recorded every word. Chad Morris approached him near the buffet, drink in hand, smiling like a man without enemies. "Heard you had a rough week," he said, sipping bourbon. "You're not the first. Won't be the last. This town has a rhythm. Best to learn it." Darius tilted his head. "And if you don't?" Chad smiled wider. "Then the town learns you." He clinked his glass against Darius's and walked away. Later that evening, Ryan and Brandon found Darius near the back hallway. Brandon smirked, eyes gleaming. "So what's your story, huh? You undercover or something?" Ryan burst out laughing, nudging Brandon. "Yeah, right. Imagine this dude as a cop. Would be the best comedy we've seen all year." Darius didn't laugh. He simply looked at them, something in his stare too controlled. Brandon stepped closer, voice dropping. "What's your game, man? You too calm. Guys like you. You either scared or plotting. Which is it?" Darius leaned in, voice low. "Which do you want it to be?" Ryan scoffed. "Neither. I just want your face off the streets." Brandon added, "Fairgrove's not for you. Might wanna remember that." Darius held eye contact a beat longer than usual, then walked away without a word. That night, he listened to the recordings. Not just from the banquet, but from weeks prior. A pattern was emerging: language, threats, names. He started compiling the case summary. Each officer had his own section. Chad's voice appeared over 20 times in conversations covering retaliation tactics. Brandon spoke openly about covering up arrests. Ryan had been recorded laughing about planting contraband during traffic stops. But what chilled Darius most was how normalized it all was. None of them whispered. None of them hesitated. It wasn't strategy. It was culture. The following morning, an anonymous tip landed on Chad Morris's desk. A citizen claiming to have recordings. Demanding an internal investigation. Chad laughed it off, another crank. But something about it stayed with him. He began asking around. That afternoon, he called Brandon. "We got a leak," he said. "Could be real. Could be fake. But I don't like it." Brandon growled, "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Chad didn't answer. He didn't need to. By evening, Brandon pulled up outside the garage, engine rumbling. Darius was locking up when he stepped out. "We need to talk," Brandon said, hand near his belt. Darius turned, calm as ever. "I'm off duty." Brandon's voice sharpened. "You think you're smart. You think you can walk around here like you own the place. But people like you. You get found out. You always get found out." Darius didn't flinch. "Then I guess we'll see, won't we?" Brandon stepped closer, fists clenched. "You want trouble?" Darius kept his voice low. "No. I want truth." They stood there for seconds that stretched. Then Brandon backed off, muttering, "Watch yourself." He drove off, tires screeching. Darius returned home and began the final phase. Backup files uploaded. Distribution protocols activated. One click, and every file, every recording, every image, would be sent to the DOJ, the Bureau, multiple civil rights organizations, and national media. But he didn't press it. Not yet. Because the next day was the hearing. A routine city case. Boring. Overlooked. Scheduled to be handled quietly. But Darius had made sure to be on the docket. And the officers didn't know. The judge had changed. The defense attorney had changed. And the witness list had changed. As he buttoned his shirt that morning, the weight in his chest wasn't fear, it was anticipation. Everything was in place. He wasn't just walking into a courtroom. He was walking into a reckoning. But even Darius, prepared as he was, had no idea how quickly the balance would shift or how, in just a few hours, the same courtroom that had laughed in his face would fall into dead silence because what he was about to reveal would change everything. The courtroom was colder than usual that morning. Not because of the air conditioning, but because of something unspoken floating in the air, something taut, uneasy, heavy. The benches were half full, a mix of police officers in uniform, local government clerks, and a few reporters who had shown up out of habit rather than instinct. On the surface, it was a routine hearing, a minor civil motion involving disputed evidence in a property case. Nothing big. Nothing that screamed headlines. At least, not until Darius Whitaker walked through the door. He moved with the kind of confidence that didn't beg for attention but demanded it in silence. Dark tailored suit. Crisp white shirt. No tie. A simple silver lapel pin, barely noticeable unless you were trained to recognize it. A federal badge, reimagined in minimalist design. He walked past the bailiff with a nod, didn't look at the row of officers near the back, didn't pause when Brandon Duke muttered under his breath, "Look who's back to beg." Darius kept walking until he reached the front row, leaned down, whispered something to the court clerk, and handed her an envelope marked, "Priority, sealed." She froze for a moment, eyes scanning his face, and then nodded. She moved quickly toward the judge's chamber. At that very moment, Chad Morris entered through the side door, flanked by two junior officers. He looked out over the room like he owned it. But as soon as his eyes landed on Darius, something inside him faltered. His smile tightened. His shoulders stiffened. Darius gave him nothing in return, just a glance, slow and deliberate. No smile. No smirk. Just acknowledgement. A signal that the pieces were moving. The judge, an older black woman named Marlene Hayes, stepped out minutes later, holding the sealed envelope. She walked directly to the bench without ceremony. Her face gave nothing away. She opened the file slowly, eyes narrowing with each page. Then she looked up, locked eyes with Darius, then turned toward the prosecution and said, "We're taking a procedural pause." Both counsels, approach. The attorneys approached, confused, exchanging whispers. She didn't raise her voice. "What's inside this file," she said slowly, "is no longer a civil matter. We're escalating this to federal jurisdiction. Effective immediately." The room stilled. Brandon stood halfway up from his seat. "What the hell does that mean?" he blurted. Ryan Kessler, sitting beside him, leaned forward, frowning. "What's going on?" Chad, still frozen, looked toward the bench, then at Darius, who now stood, calmly, and adjusted the cuffs of his jacket before stepping toward the witness stand. Judge Hayes gestured. "Mr. Whitaker. I believe it's time." Darius nodded once. Then he spoke, not as a suspect, not as a defendant, not as a man accused of anything, but with the authority of someone who had watched the system from both the inside and the outside and had finally decided to turn on the light. "My name is Darius Whitaker," he said, his voice deep, measured, unwavering. "I'm a federal agent with the Bureau. Badge number 875921. For the past 8 months, I've been operating under deep cover in Fairgrove to investigate a sustained pattern of civil rights violations, misconduct, obstruction of justice, and coordinated abuse within this town's law enforcement department. He paused, letting the silence work. The material submitted to this court contains more than 240 hours of recorded audio, multiple video files, internal logs, tampered evidence reports, and documented witness statements, all implicating multiple members of this department in serious federal crimes. There was a gasp near the back of the courtroom. Ryan stood suddenly, face flushed, shouting, "This is a setup. He's lying." Darius turned his head slowly. "Would you like me to play the recording of you telling Officer Martin how you planted a dime bag in the kid's locker because you didn't like his attitude? It's time-stamped. December 14th, locker room. You laughed for 6 minutes after you said it." Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He sat down slowly, breathing heavily. Brandon moved next. "You recorded us? You sneaky piece of," but before he could finish, Judge Hayes raised a hand. "Officer Duke. You are not to speak unless addressed by this court." Her voice was cold, firm, final. Darius stepped closer to the bench. "These officers mocked and humiliated me in open court. They did it believing I was just another man with no voice. They laughed about putting me down, joked about how I looked, about what kind of food I must have had in my car. But more than that, they bragged. About what they've done to others. About lives ruined. About children arrested for crimes they didn't commit. They covered for each other. Lied in reports. Threatened civilians into silence. And they did all of it believing no one would ever hold them accountable." Chad Morris finally stood. His voice cracked, the illusion of authority collapsing beneath the weight of reality. "Judge, I demand that this proceeding be sealed. There's protocol for this kind of," she didn't let him finish. "Lieutenant Morris. I have in my hands signed affidavits and federal clearance orders naming you as a target in an active FBI investigation. You will not speak another word unless you are under oath and prepared to testify to your role in suppressing civil complaints, falsifying internal records, and obstructing justice on multiple counts." Chad sat down. The silence returned. Dense. Charged. Then Darius reached into a file folder he'd placed on the edge of the witness stand. From it, he pulled a black flash drive, held it up for the court to see, and said simply, "This contains the complete archive. It has already been copied and stored in 4 locations. If anything happens to me, if anything is tampered with, the data will be sent directly to every major news outlet and civil rights agency in the country. This isn't a threat. It's a safeguard. Because justice can't afford to wait anymore." A quiet voice from the gallery broke the tension, Corey Jameson's mother, seated in the far back, tears on her cheeks. She whispered, "Thank you." It was barely audible. But it was everything. Judge Hayes nodded toward the U.S. Marshals now entering the courtroom. "Begin detainment procedures. All named officers are to be placed under federal custody effective immediately." Gasps turned to shouts. Officers stood up, confused, angry, panicked. But the marshals moved quickly. Brandon was the first to resist, shouting, flailing, until a firm hand pressed him against the bench. Chad tried to negotiate, still thinking he had leverage, but no one listened. And in the middle of all of it, of the arrests, the chaos, the collapsing power, Darius stood still. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He didn't raise his voice. Because this wasn't revenge. This was truth. And it was only the beginning. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the courtroom like distant thunder. The very same cuffs once used by those officers now wrapped around their own wrists, biting into their skin with the same indifference they'd shown to so many others. The balance of power had shifted in one irreversible instant, and for the first time in their careers, they were on the receiving end of the justice they had long manipulated. But even in that moment, Darius knew it wasn't enough to just arrest them. This wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure. It was about truth echoing louder than denial. As Brandon Duke was pulled to his feet, rage burning in his eyes, he twisted toward Darius with a voice cracked by disbelief and humiliation. "You set us up," he growled, spitting the words through clenched teeth. "You think this makes you a hero?" Darius didn't flinch. His tone remained calm, unwavering. "You set yourself up the day you laughed in that courtroom like it was a game. I just gave the world a mirror." Brandon's face twisted into something between fury and fear, but the marshals pulled him back before he could lunge forward. Ryan sat slumped on the bench, sweat glistening on his forehead, his voice small now, hollow. It was how we were trained. It was always like this." He stared ahead as if waiting for someone, anyone, to justify the system that had collapsed under its own weight. Darius turned to him, voice lower now, almost heavy with the weight of what he'd witnessed. "Then maybe that's the problem. Maybe you were trained to follow hate and wear it like it was a badge. But the minute you had a choice, you made it worse. You made it your language." Judge Hayes rose from the bench, her voice cutting through the tension with sharp authority. "This court is in recess until the federal transfer is completed. No one leaves until I say otherwise." Then she looked directly at Darius, not as a judge to a witness, but as a black woman to a black man who had just shattered the silence in a place built to keep it intact. Her eyes held no words, only gravity. A silent acknowledgement. A thank you carried without breath. Outside the courtroom, a crowd had started to form. News spread fast in Fairgrove, and even faster online. Reporters, cameras, microphones. Some people shouted in confusion, others in support. Protest signs began to appear like wildfire, handwritten, hurried, furious. "Justice for Corey," one read. "Dismantle the system," said another. Darius stepped through the double doors into the chaos, and for a second, all eyes turned to him. He didn't smile. He didn't raise a fist. He just stood tall, knowing what it meant for them to see him standing. Then a voice cracked through the noise. Mrs. Jameson, Corey's mother, pushed through the crowd until she reached him. Her face trembled with emotion, years of silence suddenly breaking open like a flood. "You did this for him, didn't you?" she asked, voice tight with grief and awe. Darius nodded slowly. "I couldn't bring him back. But I could make sure they never erase him again." She reached for his hand, squeezing it with the strength of 100 mothers. Her eyes filled with tears, but behind them burned something else: relief, pride, justice. At that moment, a man in a suit approached. Special Agent Nathan Cross from the Bureau, a senior official who'd worked quietly behind the scenes throughout the investigation. His expression was neutral, professional, but his tone held something different, a rare mixture of respect and gravity. "It's done," he said. "They're in custody. You'll be debriefed in D.C. within 72 hours. You made history today." Darius met his gaze and responded without ceremony. History doesn't matter if it doesn't lead to change. Later, in the quiet of the city building now cleared out and stripped of illusion, Darius walked the halls once roamed by men who believed they were untouchable. The offices were silent now, the nameplates still hanging but empty. He stepped into the records room, where file cabinets held the weight of 1,000 forgotten voices. He pulled open one drawer, scanned the names, so many of them young, black, unseen. His hand hovered over a file labeled, "Jameson, Corey." He took it, opened it. Redacted lines. Missing pages. Inaccurate timestamps. A cover-up in ink and silence. He pulled out a pen and began writing. Not an official report, not a memo, just the truth. Names. Dates. What really happened. He left it inside the folder and returned it to the drawer. Some truths weren't just for justice. They were for memory. Back in the courtroom, the mood had shifted. Officers not under investigation sat stone-faced, unsure whether to speak or retreat. One of them, a younger black officer named Ellis, approached Darius as he prepared to leave. He looked conflicted, torn between the uniform he wore and the man standing before him. "I didn't know," Ellis said, voice quiet, burdened. "I mean, I knew it was bad. But I didn't know it was this bad." Darius studied him for a long second, then said, "Then maybe now you'll decide who you want to be in that uniform. Because silence is a choice too." Ellis nodded, eyes lowered. It wasn't redemption. But maybe it was a beginning. The next morning, the town of Fairgrove woke to headlines they never imagined. Undercover FBI agent exposes systemic racism in local police department. The story had gone national. Media vans lined the courthouse. City officials scrambled to release statements. The police chief resigned within hours. Civil rights attorneys arrived by noon. Lawsuits began filing like dominoes. But more than all of that, people talked. Not whispered. Talked. In classrooms. On sidewalks. At church steps. About race. About abuse. About truth. Darius stayed for 3 more days. He watched the town begin to unravel and rebuild at once. He met with community leaders. Spoke quietly with mothers and fathers who had buried their faith in the system. He answered questions, but never claimed glory. Because none of this had ever been about him. Before leaving, he stopped by Corey's grave. No cameras. No crowd. Just him and the quiet. He crouched down, placed a hand on the headstone, and said softly, "They know your name now. They can't erase it." Then he stood, adjusted his coat, and walked away. On his way out of Fairgrove, he passed by the courthouse one last time. The doors were open. Inside, a town was beginning to face itself. And Darius Whitaker, agent, witness, survivor, left not as a symbol, not as a savior, but as a man who had turned silence into consequence. What came next would shake more than a town. Because Fairgrove wasn't alone. And now, the world was watching. The aftermath didn't come with fireworks or celebration, it came with silence. The kind of silence that hangs in the air after something monumental has cracked the surface of what everyone pretended was normal. Fairgrove didn't crumble overnight, but it shifted in ways that would never allow it to go back. In the days following the courtroom revelation, the local police station stood eerily quiet. Officers who had once strutted through the building now moved with caution, uncertainty trailing behind every step. The hallways were stripped of noise, the locker rooms emptied of bravado. The power that once radiated from every badge and gun was now covered in questions no one could dodge. It wasn't just about the officers arrested, it was about those who had stood by, watched, and said nothing. Darius had left town, but his presence remained. His name was spoken in hushed voices and on bold radio interviews, in prayer circles and student discussions. He became a symbol of reckoning, but also of responsibility. People wanted to believe he had fixed everything, that the bad apples were removed, and the town could return to normal. But Darius had done something far more complicated, he'd forced Fairgrove to see itself. And that was a burden it wasn't ready to carry. The town had split into two, those who finally felt seen, and those who felt exposed. And in the middle were people who didn't know what to do with what they now knew. City council meetings grew crowded. Faces that had never stepped into chambers before now filled every seat. Demands were made, new hiring policies, body cam regulations, external oversight committees. But resistance surfaced too. A group calling themselves the Protectors of Blue started handing out flyers claiming Darius had fabricated everything. They tried to repaint the exposed officers as victims of a witch hunt. Their protests were small at first, just murmurs, glares at community meetings. But over time, their presence became louder, more organized, clinging to the idea that power lost must mean injustice done. Amidst the tension, the town's children watched everything. They saw which adults stood on which sides. They heard the words their parents whispered at dinner tables. And for many of them, it was the first time they realized justice wasn't neutral. A high school civics teacher named Ms. Bell decided to address it head-on. She began her lesson with a question: what does it take to be brave? Not one student answered immediately. But then a girl named Layla, 16, daughter of a woman once stopped by Officer Kessler for driving suspiciously, raised her hand. Brave, she said softly, is telling the truth when everyone's telling you to stay quiet. That idea spread. Not because Layla's voice was loud, but because it resonated. People began to speak up. Not just about police abuse, but about housing discrimination, job inequality, classroom bias. Darius had cracked open more than just a case, he'd opened a conversation Fairgrove had spent decades avoiding. And while some tried to shut it down, others couldn't unhear what had already been said. Meanwhile, at the state level, investigations rippled outward. Neighboring towns were scrutinized. Past complaints previously buried under bureaucracy were reopened. Files long thought lost resurfaced. Officers in other counties quietly resigned, hoping to escape before the spotlight reached them. But it was too late. What had begun in a single courtroom now expanded like wildfire. Darius's recordings had been reviewed by multiple civil rights organizations, and the Department of Justice had launched a broader audit across the region. The press moved in waves, some stories distorted the narrative, focusing only on the scandal, ignoring the deeper implications. But others, especially those told by black journalists, focused on the system, the silence, the courage it took to break both. Not everyone was pleased. There were threats. Subtle ones, at first, anonymous letters, vague comments online. Then, a rock through the window of the community center where Ms. Bell held forums. The mayor, once quiet during the height of the scandal, was now forced to take a stand. In a televised address, he stumbled through phrases like unfortunate revelations and need for healing, but never said the word racism. That silence, again, rang louder than anything else. And it pushed more people to the edge of choosing which side they stood on. In Washington, D.C., Darius sat in a sterile conference room with 2 FBI officials and a DOJ attorney. His debriefing had lasted hours: facts, names, methodology. But it was the final question that lingered. The DOJ official leaned forward, eyes locked on Darius, and asked, "Given what you saw, what would you do differently?" Darius didn't answer right away. He stared at his hands, not because he was unsure, but because the question itself revealed the deeper problem. Finally, he said, "You think this is about one town? It's not. It's about a system designed to bury its sins. If I'd done anything differently, I might not have gotten the truth. But even with the truth, we're still asking the wrong people for permission to change." Back in Fairgrove, the arrested officers awaited trial. Their legal teams were aggressive, trying to suppress the recordings, discredit Darius, point out procedural irregularities. They argued entrapment, bias, character assassination. The courtroom began to feel familiar again, but this time, the public was watching. People from across the state showed up, not just for justice, but for representation. Families of victims showed photos. Church choirs sang outside the courthouse. Even children held signs. The court, once a fortress of silence, now echoed with presence. But as the movement grew, so did the danger. One night, a fire broke out at the home of a local journalist who'd published the full transcript of Darius's testimony. It was ruled arson. No suspects were found. Tension rose again. People questioned whether the system was truly changing, or just being painted over with new language. And for Darius, watching all this unfold from afar, the question became heavier: had he done enough? That's when the call came, from Ellis, the young black officer who had spoken to him days after the arrests. His voice shook, not from fear, but from urgency. "They're planning something," he said. "Not just lawyers. A few of them, former officers, they're angry, dangerous. They don't want to wait for trial. They want to take control back. Darius listened carefully. How do you know? He asked. Ellis hesitated. Because they tried to bring me in. Said I'd be safer with them than without. But I remember what you said. Silence is a choice. Now Darius had a new decision. He could walk away. He'd done his job. The investigation was complete. The court system was in motion. Or he could step back in, not as an agent, but as a witness, a man willing to stand up again even when the story was supposed to be over. And the risk this time was different. It wasn't just his mission on the line, it was his safety, his identity, and his ability to believe that truth could survive retaliation. He sat alone in his apartment that night, staring at the folder still unopened on his desk. Inside were updates from federal monitors, data about Fairgrove's changes, testimonies from victims finally being heard. But none of it felt like closure. Not when people still feared the cost of telling the truth. Not when young officers like Ellis were being pulled between silence and courage. The next morning, Darius packed a small bag. He placed the flash drive, now copied and archived in multiple locations, in his coat pocket. And as he zipped the bag closed, he knew something had changed. He wasn't just returning to protect a case. He was returning to protect a future. One where justice wasn't a surprise but a standard. One where people like Corey Jameson weren't forgotten. But what Darius didn't know, was that someone else was watching him now. And what waited in Fairgrove was not just the final chapter. It was a test. Of how far justice could really go when the system itself is watching you back. Darius stepped off the train just after sunset, the quiet rhythm of Fairgrove's modest station hitting his chest like the echo of a memory he hadn't asked for. The town hadn't changed much in the days he'd been gone, same cracked sidewalks, same low-hanging trees stretching like arms over roads paved more with history than progress. But the energy was different. Tense. Watching. He could feel it in the way people slowed their cars when they passed him, how eyes lingered just a beat too long from behind store windows and curtain slits. Fairgrove was no longer unaware, it was alert. And not in the way a town looks at a man who saved them, but in the way a house full of secrets fears the one person who still holds the key. He didn't go to a hotel. Instead, he met Ellis behind the old gymnasium of the community rec center, where the security cameras had long stopped working and the building buzzed with the faint hum of bad wiring. Ellis looked older than he had days ago. Not in age, but in pressure. The kind of pressure that bends a person's posture and clouds their voice with something heavier than fear, it was duty, and the realization of how costly it could be. He didn't shake Darius's hand. He just looked at him and said, "They're planning to make you disappear." Darius didn't respond immediately. He waited, letting the words settle into the concrete beneath their feet, into the air between them. Ellis went on, voice low, clipped. Two of the former officers, one of them was in the room during your first court appearance, have been meeting at an old property on the edge of town. Barn turned safe house. They've been stockpiling files, photos, maybe weapons. I don't know what's real or bluff. But I know this, they're scared. And scared men do stupid things. Darius finally spoke, voice calm but edged with steel. You didn't have to call me. Ellis looked down, shaking his head. I didn't have a choice. Not after what you did. Not after I watched those men fall apart because someone finally told the truth. I can't go back to pretending. There was a pause, thick with tension. Then Ellis added, quieter this time, but I need to know, are you staying? Because if you're not, I need to start figuring out how to protect the people they'll come after next. That was the question Darius had asked himself every hour since he got the call. But hearing it aloud made it real. Made it immediate. He looked at Ellis, then at the horizon over the cracked gym windows, and said, I'm not leaving. They parted ways under the cover of darkness. Darius walked the long way back toward the east side of town, where a small rental house had been arranged for him under a different name. As he passed through familiar streets, faces turned away. Others nodded subtly. The division was clear, those who feared him, and those who saw him as the only thing standing between them and silence. When he reached the porch, he paused, letting the night settle around him before unlocking the door. The house was sparsely furnished, bed, chair, table, but it was enough. He pulled out the new files he'd received that morning, updates from DOJ, copies of testimony from others who had come forward after his story broke. Among them was a letter from a woman named Evelyn Grant. It was handwritten, shaky. She said her son had been arrested 3 years ago on false charges, his record destroyed, his scholarships revoked. Her last line read, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, thank you for making me feel like someone finally saw us." The next day, he returned to the courthouse, not as a witness, not as an agent, but as a citizen. He took a seat in the gallery for the preliminary hearing of one of the accused officers. The room buzzed, different from last time. The media wasn't as loud now. The spectacle had dimmed. What remained were those who understood the stakes. Families. Local leaders. Victims. And in the front row sat Mrs. Jameson again, her face calmer now, less grief-stricken but still burning with quiet rage. She turned to Darius when he sat, nodded once, then whispered, "They tried to ruin us. But you made them look at us." He didn't reply, just held her gaze for a moment. That was enough. During the hearing, the defense team focused on procedure, claiming that Darius had overstepped, had manipulated events to incite an outcome. They painted him as a rogue agent, a man with a vendetta disguised as justice. It was a brutal attempt to shift focus. But then, the prosecution began calling witnesses, ordinary people from Fairgrove. A father who'd been stopped 3 times in a single week. A high school teacher who'd lost students to the juvenile system without ever seeing the reports. A nurse who'd watched a young boy handcuffed in the ER while bleeding. Their voices weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. The truth doesn't shout when it has weight. At the end of the session, Darius was approached by someone unexpected, Chad Morris's daughter, Melissa. She was in her early 20s, her posture stiff, guarded. Her voice shook when she spoke. "I didn't come here to defend him. I want to understand. Did he always know what he was doing?" Darius looked at her, and for a moment, he didn't see the daughter of a corrupt officer. He saw a young woman burdened by legacy. "That's not for me to say," he answered carefully. "But every day, we all make a choice, either to speak up or stay comfortable. Your father made his choice. Now it's yours." She nodded slowly, eyes misted, then walked away, shoulders straight. The night that followed was long. Darius sat by the window, staring at the town below. Lights flickered on and off in houses that once ignored the cries of those violated by the badge. He thought about every sacrifice, every name still unheard, every family waiting for justice not yet served. And then came the knock. 3 short taps. Not the kind a neighbor makes. The kind meant to signal something unspoken. He moved cautiously, weapon drawn but lowered. Through the peephole, he saw Ellis again, face tense. Darius opened the door, and Ellis stepped in quickly, locking it behind him. "They're not waiting anymore," Ellis said without preamble. "They're planning something tonight. I just heard the tail end of it on the radio. Code words. Locations. They're calling it restoration." Darius felt his gut tighten. "Where?" Ellis handed him a map, finger pointing to the outskirts. "The barn. Midnight." Darius nodded. "I'll go." Ellis's eyes widened. "You can't walk into that alone." Darius replied, "I'm not. I'm bringing the truth with me." As the clock neared midnight, Darius made his way through the woods behind the barn, quiet, calculating. His body moved like a shadow, trained and sharp, every sound filtered, every step measured. He wasn't there for confrontation, he was there for exposure. Hidden on him were 2 micro-recorders and a live transmitter patched to DOJ in DC. If anything went wrong, the entire conversation would be streamed and stored within seconds. Inside the barn, voices grew louder. He recognized a few, former officers, their rage now stoked into something dangerous. He waited for the right moment. Then, slowly, he stepped into the light. The room froze. The men turned, stunned. One of them, a tall, thick-shouldered man named Trent, sneered. "Look who couldn't stay gone." Darius raised his hands, unarmed, calm. "I came to hear what you had to say." Another man barked, "You think this is still your story?" Darius's voice was steady. "It never was mine. It's yours. I just gave it a microphone." Trent stepped closer. "You ruined lives." Darius didn't move. "No. I revealed the truth. You ruined your own lives the day you chose silence over justice." The room grew heated, men circling, yelling. But Darius stood still, speaking louder now. "This ends with you tonight. Whatever you think you're restoring, fear, silence, control, it's already gone." As the tension neared its peak, red and blue lights burst through the cracks in the barn wood. Sirens. Marshals. Federal agents. A voice on a megaphone echoed through the trees. "This is a federal operation. Drop your weapons. Come out with your hands visible." Chaos exploded inside. Shouting. Curses. Some ran. Others froze. But Darius remained rooted, the storm around him now fully exposed. He turned to Trent, who stood shaking, caught in the collapse of the illusion he'd tried to protect. "You thought hiding in the dark would protect you. But the truth doesn't need light to exist. It just needs someone to carry it." As agents stormed in, detaining the remaining men, Darius stepped outside into the night, the weight of what had just happened pressing into every bone in his body. He didn't smile. He didn't breathe easy. But he knew this, he had walked into the heart of their last stronghold and proven one thing, the truth they buried was still alive. And now, the reckoning wasn't just legal. It was moral. And far from over. The hours following the raid blurred into a haze of floodlights, rustling boots, and the metallic clinks of cuffs tightening over trembling wrists. Darius stood under the open sky, his breath rising in short clouds, not from fear or fatigue, but from the overwhelming weight of watching yet another layer of the sickness being peeled away. The barn that had once echoed with conspiratorial whispers now rang hollow, filled only with the sounds of defeat and the murmurs of law enforcement gathering statements and inventorying evidence. The sting operation had been successful, but the impact of what had just happened was still unraveling around him. Federal agents moved with urgency, their expressions tight, purposeful. Every confiscated file, every overheard word from the men inside, former officers who now clung to delusion and desperation, added another piece to a puzzle that seemed never-ending. Darius knew they weren't the last. He knew systems like these didn't just crumble in a night, no matter how explosive the moment. Ellis arrived 20 minutes after the barn had been secured. His patrol car rolled in slowly, headlights cutting through the dust, his face shadowed and pale. He stepped out without a word, his eyes finding Darius across the field. For a long moment, they didn't speak. Just stood there, 2 men divided by duty, drawn together by truth. Then Ellis stepped closer, his voice raw. They had pictures. Maps. One of them had a list of names. Darius nodded once. "I know." Ellis clenched his jaw. "Your name was at the top." There was no need for dramatics. The message was clear. Darius looked away, eyes scanning the tree line, then back to Ellis. "That's what scared them the most. That I didn't disappear. Inside the temporary mobile office, now set up at the perimeter of the scene, federal officers debriefed Darius with rapid-fire questions, their concern heightened. He was no longer just an agent or a whistleblower. He had become the face of something larger than the Bureau was ready to confront. The lead field officer, a woman named Agent Morales, leaned in during a break in the questioning, her voice low but laced with sincerity. "What you've done here, it's going to follow you, Darius. These men weren't just acting out of hate. They were trying to protect a system that sees people like you as threats simply for standing upright." Darius met her gaze, steady. "Then let it follow me. I'll keep walking." Over the next few days, Fairgrove changed again. Not in loud, sweeping gestures, but in the quiet reshuffling of authority and the subtle crack of a foundation struggling to hold. The arrests at the barn had sent a ripple through the town's core. Churches began to speak openly about what had long been whispered. Students wrote essays. Teachers asked harder questions. A mural appeared overnight on the side of the community center, Corey Jameson's face surrounded by flames that didn't burn but illuminated. It wasn't just a memorial. It was a demand. Darius found himself invited to a town hall meeting held in the gymnasium where Ellis had first warned him. He hadn't planned to speak. He had intended to sit in the back, observe, let the community own its voice. But the crowd turned, eyes searching him out, the silence an invitation he couldn't ignore. When he stood, there was no speech, no rehearsed message. He spoke plainly. "You've seen what they did. Not just to me, but to people who didn't have anyone watching. You've seen what silence protects. But now you've also seen what truth can reveal. This isn't about one man or one badge. It's about deciding, right now, what you will allow to happen in your name." A woman near the front rose with tears in her eyes. "We were scared," she said. "We didn't know who to trust." Darius replied, "You don't have to trust me. Just trust your own voice." In the days that followed, internal reviews rippled through the state's law enforcement agencies. Investigations were reopened. Complaints once dismissed found new life. Chad Morris's trial was approaching, and the pressure on the local prosecutor's office was mounting. Public defenders, once overworked and overlooked, now stood at the center of media attention, and a newly formed civilian oversight committee had begun auditing all active officers within a 100-mile radius. Some called it overreach. Others called it overdue. Melissa Morris reached out again, this time privately. She asked to meet with Darius at the town library. They sat at a corner table, surrounded by shelves filled with stories written by people long dead. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed a small envelope on the table. "These are letters," she said. "Ones my father kept. From people he arrested. People who wrote him after. Some begging. Some cursing him. Some just broken. I don't know why he kept them." Darius picked up the envelope, thumbed through the brittle pages. "Because somewhere, he knew," he said softly. Somewhere in him, he knew they were real. Melissa's voice cracked. Was he always that man? Darius looked at her, not with pity, but with clarity. He chose to be. But that doesn't mean you have to carry his silence. Later that week, Darius returned to the field office to give an official statement for the upcoming trial. He was briefed by attorneys, walked through evidentiary procedures, but none of it fazed him. He wasn't afraid of courtrooms anymore. He wasn't afraid of being seen. What lingered wasn't fear, it was fatigue. The fatigue of being forced to prove what should have already been believed. Of having to risk his life just to get people to listen. Of knowing there were still more names, more families, more towns where the truth remained buried under layers of denial. That night, Ellis invited him to dinner. Not at a restaurant. At his home. It was small, modest, but warm. His wife served chicken and rice, his daughter showed Darius her science project. For a moment, it felt like peace. Not because the world had changed, but because two people had dared to change their part of it. After dinner, as the dishes clinked in the sink, Ellis sat across from Darius on the back porch. "You know," he said quietly, "I always thought being a cop meant keeping people safe. But I never asked who we were keeping them safe from." Darius exhaled slowly. "That's the question, isn't it?" Ellis leaned back, eyes fixed on the stars. "I still wear the badge. But I carry it different now. Not as a shield. As a reminder." Darius nodded. "Then maybe there's hope." As the trial date drew near, tensions flared again in Fairgrove. A small but loud group rallied outside the courthouse with signs reading "Protect our heroes" and "False justice is tyranny." Counter-protesters stood across the street, holding signs of their own: "Justice has no color and accountability is patriotism." The streets didn't erupt into violence, but the lines had been drawn. And in the middle of it all, Darius walked, head high, unmoved. But deep inside, he knew the cost wasn't over. He had placed himself at the center of a war few were willing to admit existed. And while he had allies now, while voices were rising, he also knew the backlash would come again. It always did. But he also knew something else: he wasn't alone anymore. One evening, as he prepared for another interview with a national news outlet, he received a package. No name. No return address. Inside, a single photograph. A group of young boys, ages 8 to 12, smiling in front of a rundown building. On the back, a handwritten note: "They said we wouldn't matter. Thanks for proving them wrong." No signature. Just impact. And in that moment, Darius realized something profound. He hadn't just exposed a system. He had disrupted its future. And that was the beginning of something unstoppable. The courtroom was full. Not packed with cameras or buzz or spectacle, this time, it was different. It was quiet, deliberate. The kind of silence that comes when people know they are standing at the edge of something irreversible. Families filled the benches, their expressions sober, eyes watching every move with quiet intensity. Some held hands. Some sat alone. And at the center of it all, Darius sat calmly in the witness section, wearing no badge, no title, just presence. Across from him sat Chad Morris, now stripped of uniform, suit pressed but trembling slightly as he waited for the judge's decision. Months had passed since his arrest, but the weight of accountability hadn't dulled. It had grown heavier. The trial had revealed not only his involvement in systematic cover-ups but also his leadership in orchestrating threats, intimidation, and illegal coordination with other officers across the region. His attorney had tried to spin it, called him a man of duty, a victim of political overcorrection. But the evidence was undeniable, and more importantly, so was the shift in public perception. This wasn't just about law. This was about truth finally being louder than fear. When the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations, no one clapped. There were no cheers. Just a breath held and released by everyone in the room at once. A quiet exhale of pain, validation, and long-awaited justice. Chad didn't speak as he was led out of the courtroom. His eyes scanned the room for something familiar, something sympathetic, but found none. His daughter, Melissa, wasn't there. She had chosen to remain outside, watching from a screen in the hallway, a quiet boundary between the man he had been and the truth she had embraced. Outside, the town didn't erupt into celebration. It moved forward. Brick by brick. The oversight committee Darius had helped establish began reviewing new policies. Officers resigned, some quietly, others under pressure. But more importantly, a new wave of recruits entered the academy, diverse, aware, willing to be held accountable. Training programs shifted. Community meetings became policy writing sessions. The badge began to mean something else, not perfection, not immunity, but responsibility. Melissa started working with a local organization focused on restorative justice. She held workshops, spoke at high schools, and openly talked about what it meant to love someone who had caused harm. Her message wasn't vengeance, it was reckoning. Accountability, she would say, isn't punishment. It's repair. It's naming the wound so we can start healing. Ellis stayed on the force, but his role transformed. He became the internal liaison for civil complaints, often the only officer black residents trusted enough to speak to. He worked directly with youth programs, even launching a mentorship initiative for kids with incarcerated parents. People began to look at him not just as a uniform, but as a bridge. He never claimed to be perfect, but he showed up, over and over again. And that, in a town like Fairgrove, meant everything. As for Darius, he declined every major interview offer. He turned down awards, panels, even a book deal. Instead, he quietly relocated to Atlanta, where he accepted a new role, not in enforcement, but in reform. The Bureau created a new department focused entirely on systemic accountability and equity, and they named Darius its inaugural director. His job wasn't undercover anymore, it was to design the very changes he once had to fight for from the shadows. He traveled the country, sitting across from chiefs, commissioners, and activists. He listened more than he spoke. But when he did speak, his voice was no longer a whisper from behind a hidden identity. It was a measured force that carried the authority of lived experience, the clarity of truth, and the power of someone who never asked for vengeance, only justice. He kept in touch with Mrs. Jameson, who had since become a leader in the statewide movement for police reform. She often sent him letters from mothers who had lost children, or whose children had survived but carried invisible scars. One letter stood out, a teenage boy who wrote, "I used to think no one could ever hear us. Now I know someone is listening." Darius framed it. Hung it in his office. Right next to Corey's photo. In the end, Fairgrove didn't become perfect. But it became honest. And sometimes, that's the hardest thing a place can do. Honesty meant no more pretending. No more shrugging off injustice as misunderstanding. It meant accountability, repair, and the courage to begin again. And while Darius didn't see himself as a hero, he never had, he knew that what he did mattered. Not because it fixed everything. But because it proved that silence was not the only option. And now, I want to talk to you, the one who stayed through every second of this story. Maybe you saw yourself in Darius. Maybe you've been silenced, underestimated, mocked, or told you didn't belong in places of power. Maybe you've witnessed injustice and felt too small to fight it. Maybe you've wondered if speaking up even matters. I want you to remember something: justice doesn't always roar, it often whispers, waits, and builds itself in the quiet choices we make every day. And when one person dares to stand up, it gives others permission to do the same. Or maybe you saw yourself in someone else in this story, in Ellis, who had to confront his silence, or Melissa, who had to face the truth about someone she loved. This story isn't just about good versus evil. It's about people making choices. It's about systems that hide behind tradition, and the bravery it takes to confront them. And it's about you. About what you'll do the next time you see injustice. Will you turn away? Or will you be the one who stays, who speaks, who shines a light? If this story moved you, challenged you, made you reflect, share it. Talk about it. Don't let it end here. And if you want more stories that twist, shock, inspire, and most importantly, tell the truth, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, leave a comment, and tell us, what would you have done in Darius's shoes? We'll be watching the comments. And we'll be listening. Always.